Individuation, becoming your true self. Individuation is the path to experiencing who you truly are. In this presentation, I'll outline the main aspects and some of the ideas from Jung, but mostly focus on individuation as an orientation to life and the practices that support this process of transformation. So, what is individuation? It's the central and most important of Jung's ideas. In fact, he wrote about it constantly towards the end of his life. And you could say that this was his obsession. Like, what does it mean for human beings to become more human? So it's a key to understanding not just Jung's ideas, but to Jung as a person and as a great psychological thinker. Now, individuation is not just a theory. It's not just a set of ideas. It's an orientation. It's a way of approaching life, not just intellectually, but in terms of practice, of what we do. And it's also an orientation to life that is about growth, about change. And Jung called it a religious attitude to life. What that means is it's really about spirituality. It's about the inner nature of spirituality and the experience of really getting in touch with yourself. And individuation as a process, as a path, requires intention. And I'll talk about that later, a particular kind of intention, but also dedication and constant practice. It's not something that just happens if we do it now and then. It's basically we have to orient ourselves towards growth, and we have to do those things which will further us along the path. And it's more related to the latter part of life. Jung would say, really, individuation only takes shape in the last part of our life. And it's about transformation rather than just changing some aspects of ourselves. So, what did Jung say about individuation? Well, he talked about it directly and indirectly in most of his later writings. He constantly delved into his own psychology, his own experience. And if you watch videos of Jung when he's an older man, you get the sense of somebody who is truly himself. And he's become, if you like, a sage or even a shaman, somebody who has this kind of magical quality. And he said that the privilege of being alive, of our lifetime, is to become who we truly are. What does that mean? It means to be complete, to realize your nature, your inner self. And he translates it, as he says, this is a quote from him, we could translate individuation as coming to selfhood or self-realization. He's one of the first people who talked about self-realization, that in fact, the self is not something which is fixed, and it's not really about our personality. It's much bigger than that. And individuation isn't about saintliness. It's not about becoming something other than yourself. It's about wholeness, completeness, integration as a human being. Why is it important? Well, it's not just personally important that we become who we're meant to be, but it's an evolution of human consciousness within each of us, and thus in humanity as a whole. We're adding to the sense in which human beings are growing, evolving, becoming more than we can imagine. The other aspect, which I believe is totally essential about individuation, is what I call inner freedom. Now, inner freedom is the sense that we can make choices. We can make choices from who we are. We can make free choices as much as possible. Because the ego is caught between the demands of the outer world and the pushes and pulls and urges which come from deep inside us. So you could say that there's the outer world on one side, and there's our complexes, our instincts, our drives. when those parts are unintegrated in us, in our unconscious, they push us around, they bully us, they make us do, feel, and think things which we don't believe is a reflection of who we truly are. This is a quote from Jung, and it's a complicated quote, so I'll try to explain it as I go along. The aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona, on the one hand, and the suggestive power of primordial images on the other. It's hard to say. So the persona is that outer aspect of ourself. It's the part that's adapted to the world, to the culture, to society's needs. It's how we've been moved and modified and manipulated to become who our society needs us to be. And you could say the persona can get a grip on you and it can kind of wrap you up. And we become identified with the persona. And that's one way in which we lose ourselves. But the other is what he calls the primordial images. Those are the things from the shadow, the unconscious aspects of ourself. Those are our complexes, which are semi-autonomous aspects of the unconscious, which can grab control of our consciousness and of our motivations and push us around. When we become more individuated, what does that feel like? What is the experience? Really, we become just who we're meant to be. We become more whole, become more complete. If you like, those parts of us which have autonomy become connected into something which is whole. And you might call this psychological maturity. Certainly a sense that certain people, when they've worked on themselves enough, become substantial, become secure in their own selves. But it's not about selfishness. It's not about ego inflation. It's not about, becoming amazing in the world. It's about realizing yourself as a human being and recognizing that selflessness is the path and that love is essential. And as we recognize and develop awareness of ourselves and of others, we also feel more connected to the world, connected to people, even connected to humanity. We experience more joy. I'm not talking about happiness exactly, and I'm not talking about pleasure or enjoyment. Joy is something different. It's something that wells up from inside us. It's close to awe. It's close to a sense of connection to everything. And through that sense of connection, we develop a greater sense of meaning and purpose in life. Michael Meade, who's a mythologist, talks about that part of us which experiences meaning and purpose as our genius. It's that aspect of ourselves which knows what we're meant to do, even if we consciously don't know it. And it has a quiet voice, what is sometimes called the still small voice of the self. And it gives us inner guidance. It's trying to nudge us, push us, sometimes actually force us to go in the right direction. But this still small voice of the self is easily drowned out by the ego, by all aspects of the ego which are pushing and pulling us, fears and desires, and the demands and distractions of the outer world. So we have to listen carefully to our inner guidance, into this voice. And we have to value and respect that voice. It is truly guiding us in the right direction. What do we need to develop in ourselves to individuate, to become more ourselves? Well, the first key element is self-awareness. Who am I? Socrates said An unexamined life is not worth living. In Greece, at that time, the temple of Apollo at Delphi had written over the door, "Know thyself." It's a fundamental aspect of being a true human being. We have to engage and sometimes struggle with that question: who am I? Who am I becoming? Without self-awareness, we are somewhat less than animals, because animals know who they are. They're acting on instinct. They maybe don't have the consciousness, but they act from their nature. They're truly themselves. And without self-awareness, we cannot know our meaning or purpose. We'll be distracted. We will be confused. And self-awareness, the development of self-awareness, is an unending task. Because we're so much greater than we recognize with our conscious mind, developing awareness of the subtleties of our experience goes on forever. Through self-awareness, we have to come to self-acceptance. I know who I am, and I am who I am, both the good aspects and the not so good aspects. Now, self-acceptance isn't about complacency. It's not ego inflation, grandiosity. It's not saying, oh, I'm the best. It's about seeing and accepting the reality of ourselves and our natures and working towards becoming something more. Self-acceptance is close to self-love. If you like, first of all, we have to tolerate ourselves. Then we have to accept ourselves, but then we can move into that sense of deep appreciation that we have this life, this body, this mind, and this soul. Through self-acceptance, we move towards self-transcendence. Self-transcendence is reaching beyond the small self, the ego. I can become more than I know, or more than I realize, more than I can even imagine. Self-transcendence allows a lot of space for the unknown and the unknowable. Because you could say God, that's the definition of God, the unknown and the unknowable. The presence of something in the universe which we cannot grasp, the ultimate reality. Something that's beyond the limitations of our mind and our understanding. And those things in self-transcendence which appear without our effort or awareness, the unexpected things, those are the truth. They are the reality. Those are the things which we need to pay attention to most. There's a key quality to individuation that I believe moves us in the right direction, and that's what I call pure intent. Now, pure intent isn't our normal intention or our motivations or desires. It's an intention that's steady, that's strong, that has direction, but it's empty of attachment and ego motivation. It isn't captured by our fears. It's not captured by our desires. It's not desperate for some outcome. It has no clinging to it. It has no attachment to the end of our intention. This quality is well illustrated by a quotation from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the foremost holy books of the Hindus. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna is talking to Arjuna. They're on the field of battle, and Arjuna doesn't want to fight, but Krishna tells him that he has to, that we always have to act in the world according to our Dharma. Now, Dharma is an interesting word. Dharma means not just our destiny or our inner guidance, but it also means our spiritual path. But we have to act without attachment to results. So Krishna says to Arjuna, actions do not cling to me because I'm not attached to their results. What he's saying is that actions which are not attached to results do not produce more karma. They do not move you along that path to rebirth. Another quotation that I really enjoy is from Rumi. He says, I will search for the friend with all my passion and all my energy until I learn that I don't need to search. Rumi's talking about his search for God. God is the friend, the unknown and the unknowable. And the paradox is that we need to strive, we need to act, we need to move along the path. But in some sense, we've already reached its destination. The transcendent is always present, it's always there and available. So, what do we need to do in a practical sense in order to move along the path of individuation? Well, the first thing we need to do, and this is particularly relevant for the foremost part of our life, is we need to do what's called ego work. We have to resolve our childhood traumas. We've got to engage with our complexes, those things which seem to be pushing us around, and the blockages, the psychic blockages. And these can actually be psychic blockages which are manifest in our body as symptoms. So we do the ego work in order to create that part of the self, which is the ego, so that it can tolerate the process of individuation. So we can tolerate the doubts, the sufferings, the difficulties. Because only once the ego is strong enough, is coherent enough, can it let down its guard and become permeable to the true self. In Jung's work, he assumed an intact and functional ego as a necessity for later individuation in the latter part of life. Now, what that means is that we do have to know ourselves, as I said, aware of ourselves, aware of how the path that we've moved along. Jung focused more on the integration of the unconscious, and this is what you might call shadow work. This is where we recognize, engage with, and integrate our dark side, those things which we've pushed aside, the things which we don't want to face. So those are the things which are actually very difficult for us to see. We can often see the dark side, the shadow, much more easily in other people. And this is because we all tend to project our shadow. We will find others who we do not like or who we do not agree with. And it is those that we believe are bad. But in fact, a lot of that badness is a projection from somewhere deep inside of us. So the shadow work is really essential. It's kind of the central part of the psychological ideas of Jung. And then we must do our soul work. And this is something which Jung addressed in an indirect way. Jung didn't know much about Buddhism, and he didn't believe that meditation, for instance, was appropriate for Westerners. But that's because he came from a particular time, a particular age, and a particular intellectual kind of culture. But soul work is the development of our spiritual practices. And those practices have to reflect our unique individuality. Because the soul is the central, unknowable core of the self. When I was quoting from Krishna, he would say it's the Atman that is really Brahman. It's God within. So what are the main practices that we need to help us on our individuation journey? Well, first of all, self-exploration and reflection. This is about mindful awareness of our inner life, our motivations, what's going on inside of us. We're often so externally oriented that we don't spend enough time actually quietly wondering and exploring and reflecting on our experiences. Psychotherapy can be really helpful to resolve traumas, blocks, stuckness, particularly if we've had difficulties in our childhood, which have, in some sense, obscured our true self. Dream work. Dream work is an essential form of inner guidance. It's about relationship with our true self, about listening to what's going on at a much deeper level, and respecting those messages which are trying to direct us towards our wholeness, our true self. And then there's relationship work. Relationship work is basically the practice of loving, whether it's with friends or with a partner or a spouse. What we need to do is to practice being the most loving person we can. And that's a way of getting in touch with our own selflessness, with not getting caught up in selfish desires, wishes, always hoping that we're right, but allowing ourselves to feel that sense of deep love which comes from inside of us. And then, of course, there's spiritual practice. All of us need some sort of spiritual practice. It could be meditation, it could be prayer, it could be walking quietly in nature, it could be sitting, just staring out the window, allowing yourself to become quiet inside. Because spiritual practice is foundational for the whole process of individuation. It's about quietening the mind, opening the heart, and allowing something more to happen beyond our expectations. And what helps that is a positive attitude, a right attitude. I believe we need to embrace every experience, good, bad, indifferent, with a kind of gentle, patient curiosity. That means that we take time to experience our experience, that we notice our experience, and that we're curious and interested in what's going on inside of us and what's going on around us. In order to do that, we pay attention, we be aware, and we take action. Those are the 3 A's. And it's very easy to remember that, which is my attention, what I pay attention to, is basically what creates my world. And that allows us to be aware. And when we're aware, then we can take action. And in order to do that, we need to balance effort with surrenders. Effort is from the ego. It's from some desire, but there are good desires as well as not so good desires. So the desire to grow, the desire to change, the desire to become more than we are, that's a good desire. But it only reaches so far. And then we have to let go. We have to surrender. We have to allow the self and the soul to take charge. And that's often quite difficult for us. Surrender is probably one of the most difficult practices that we can have. We need to practice self-compassion, but not just that kind of self-compassion which allows whatever happens to happen, but it has to have some discipline, some structure, some way of holding things together. If you like, self-compassion is the yin, discipline is the yang. They go together. We need to be forgiving of ourselves and our mistakes, but we also have to have the discipline not to do those things again. When in doubt, be still, be quiet, and patient. Agitation and distraction blocks our self-awareness, blocks the channel in which we can be in touch with our true inner nature. Inner guidance arises out of stillness, arises unexpectedly from a place which we are not always aware of. So each day, we need to take that time to be quiet, to be patiently awaiting whatever needs to arise from inside.